Eleanor Caldwell picked up the plate of thin gray soup, looked at it for exactly 3 seconds, and threw the whole thing into the dirt. Every ranch hand standing in that yard went dead silent. Thomas Caldwell stared at his wife, this large, heavy-breathed woman who had arrived on his ranch 2 days ago, carrying nothing but an old suitcase and a wooden recipe box, and his jaw tightened. "That," Eleanor said, pointing at the splattered bowl, "is not food. That is an insult, and I will not feed insults to men who break their backs for you." Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. And in that moment, everything at Willow Creek Ranch changed. If this story already has your heart beating faster, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell so you never miss what happens next. Drop the name of your city in the comments below. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now settle in, because what Eleanor Caldwell did next is something nobody in Willow Creek Valley ever forgot. Thomas Caldwell had not spoken a single word to his wife for the entire 2-mile ride from town. He sat rigid on the wagon bench, reins loose in his hands, eyes fixed on the dry Montana road ahead. Eleanor sat beside him with her old suitcase wedged between her feet and her wooden recipe box balanced carefully on her lap. She did not try to fill the silence. She had learned long ago that silence told you more about a person than any words they might choose. She watched him instead. She noticed how his jaw was set too tight for a man who was simply quiet. She noticed the way his eyes moved across his own land, like a man counting everything he might be about to lose. She noticed the dirt under his fingernails and the fraying at his collar, and the particular way exhausted men hold themselves when they have stopped believing that rest is coming. Thomas Caldwell was not a cold man. He was a frightened one. Eleanor had seen that before. She had been raised by a frightened man, her father, who had loved his family fiercely but had never once known how to say so, who had shown everything he felt through work and silence and the meals he made sure were always on the table, even when money was short. Eleanor had learned to read men like her father the way other women learned to read weather. You watched the small things. You waited. You did not push. So she said nothing on that wagon ride. She simply held her recipe box and looked at the land. Montana in the summer of 1885 was harsh and beautiful in equal measure. The grass had gone yellow-brown from drought. The sky was enormous and pale and relentless. The mountains in the distance looked like something painted by a man who had never actually seen mountains. Too dramatic, too jagged, too impossible. But the light was extraordinary. Late afternoon gold that turned everything it touched into something worth keeping. Eleanor thought, there is something good here, something worth fighting for. She did not yet know how hard that fight would be. Willow Creek Ranch appeared over a low rise, and Eleanor's first clear look at it told her everything. Everything Thomas Caldwell's letters had carefully avoided saying. The main house was standing, but barely proud of the fact. The front porch sagged on one corner. 2 of the barn doors were hanging wrong, one hinge missing from each. The fence line that ran along the east pasture had 3 sections down entirely, patched with rope in places and simply left open in others. The cattle she could see were thin. Not dangerously so, not yet, but thin enough that a woman who had grown up watching her father's stock knew what she was looking at. This ranch was not struggling. This ranch was failing. And Thomas Caldwell had written her letters describing a working operation and room to grow and honest frontier living, which were the careful words a proud man used when he could not bring himself to write the truth. Eleanor did not say any of this. She stepped down from the wagon before Thomas could come around to help her, landing solidly on the Montana dirt, and she stood up straight and looked at the house and breathed in the smell of dry grass and cattle and distant wood smoke and something else, something coming from the direction of the cookhouse, that made her stomach turn. Burned fat, old grease, the particular smell of food that had been poorly stored and poorly cooked for a very long time. That was the problem she could fix first. The ranch hands materialized slowly, the way men do when they want to look like they weren't watching. They came from the barn, from the fence line, from around the side of the house. 7 of them in total, ranging from a boy who couldn't have been more than 17 to a man whose gray beard suggested he had been working cattle since before the war. They wore the same expression, all 7 of them. That particular combination of curiosity and barely concealed amusement that Eleanor recognized immediately. They were waiting to see how long she would last. Thomas cleared his throat. "Men, this is my wife, Mrs. Caldwell." A few of them nodded. The boy pulled his hat off. The gray-bearded man said, "Ma'am," in a voice that was perfectly polite and entirely non-committal. "Mrs. Caldwell," said a lean, sharp-faced man near the front. She would later learn his name was Deke, and that he considered himself the unofficial voice of the ranch hands. "Welcome to Willow Creek." He paused just long enough to be deliberate about it. "Thomas says you're going to be taking over the kitchen." "That's right," Eleanor said. Deke's mouth curved. "Well, we'll see how that goes." Eleanor looked at him steadily for a moment. "Yes," she agreed. "You will." She picked up her suitcase, tucked her recipe box under her arm, and walked toward the house without waiting to be shown where it was. Behind her, she heard the low sound of men exchanging glances. She did not turn around. The kitchen was worse than the smell had suggested. Eleanor stood in the doorway for a long moment, just taking stock. The stove was a good one, a proper cast iron range, large enough to feed a crew. But it had not been properly cleaned in months, and there was grease baked onto the surface in layers that would take real work to remove. The shelves were disorganized, the kind of disorganized that happened when someone had been grabbing whatever was closest for a long time and never putting anything back in the same place twice. Flour sack open and sagging. Salt in a container with no lid. 3 different jars of something that might have been preserves, none of them labeled, one of them definitely gone bad. The supply pantry off the back wall held enough to feed the men, technically, but only technically. Beans, dried salt pork, some cornmeal, hardtack, the kind of stores that kept a man alive, and nothing more. Thomas appeared in the doorway behind her. "Cook left 3 months ago," he said. He had the slightly defensive tone of a man expecting to be criticized. "The men have been managing." "I can see that," Eleanor said, still looking at the pantry shelves. "There's enough there to—" "Thomas." She turned around. "When did your men last have a hot breakfast before they went to work?" He blinked. "They eat before—" "When did they last have a hot breakfast? Eggs, biscuits, something that would hold them through a full morning of hard labor?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Eleanor nodded slowly. "And you wonder why the fences are taking twice as long to fix." Thomas opened his mouth. Then he closed it. "I'll need to go back to town tomorrow," Eleanor said, turning back to the shelves. "The supply situation here needs to be addressed before I can do anything properly. We don't have money to—" "I'm not asking you to buy champagne and beefsteak," she said, not unkindly. "I'm asking you to let me spend what is necessary to feed these men properly, because what you're spending now is waste. You're paying 7 men to work on half rations and then wondering why the work isn't getting done." Thomas was quiet for a moment. "You've been here 2 hours," he finally said. "Yes," Eleanor agreed. "And I've already found your first problem." He left without another word. Eleanor turned back to the stove, rolled up her sleeves, and got to work. She cleaned that kitchen until after midnight. Thomas came to the doorway twice, once around 8 o'clock with an expression she couldn't quite read, and once close to 11 with a cup of coffee that he set on the table near her without speaking, and then left again. She drank it cold, an hour later, without stopping what she was doing. By the time she finally went to bed in the small room off the back of the house, her hands were raw, and her back was aching, and the kitchen smelled, for the first time in what she suspected was a very long time, like a place where food could be made properly. She lay in the darkness and listened to the Montana night and thought about what she had walked into. She had known it would be hard. She had not let herself think too carefully about how hard. Eleanor Whitaker, Eleanor Caldwell now, still strange to think, had answered Thomas's advertisement in the Helena paper not because she had nowhere else to go, though that was somewhat true. She had answered it because she was 34 years old, and she had spent her entire life being the woman people looked at and immediately decided they already knew everything about. Too heavy, too slow, too soft for real work. She had heard those words in so many different voices that she could have recited them in her sleep. her mother's neighbors, her father's business associates. The men who had courted her briefly and then retreated when they realized she would not become smaller to make them more comfortable. The woman at the church in Billings who had told her, with genuine kindness that made it somehow worse, that she had such a pretty face, if only. Eleanor had stopped listening to that sentence before it finished. She knew what came after if only. She had come to Willow Creek Ranch because Thomas Caldwell's advertisement had said he needed someone who could work, and she could work. God, she could work. She had been working since she was 8 years old, and her mother died, and her father needed someone to run the house. And because Montana was far enough from everything she had known that she could be someone different here. Not smaller, just different. She closed her eyes. She thought about the look on Deke's face. That little curved smile. We'll see how that goes. She thought about Thomas watching her from the doorway at midnight, unreadable, with a cup of coffee in his hand. She thought about 7 men eating burned beans and hardtack before 12-hour days of brutal frontier labor. She thought about that plate of gray soup she had thrown into the dirt. Yes, she thought. We will see. She was asleep inside 3 minutes. The next morning, Eleanor was up before dawn. She moved through the dark kitchen by touch and memory, having made careful note of where she'd put everything the night before. She got the stove lit, got the coffee on, and then did the most honest inventory she could of what she had to work with. Not much, but enough. By the time the first gray light was coming through the east-facing window, she had biscuits in the oven, real biscuits, rolled and cut, not dropped, and a skillet of salt pork beginning to render down, and the beginnings of a gravy that was going to be simple but would taste like something a person actually wanted to eat. The first man through the door was the boy. He stopped dead when he smelled the biscuits. "Morning," Eleanor said, without turning from the stove. "Ma'am." He sounded confused. Are those biscuits?" "They are." A pause. "Real ones?" "I don't know any other kind." He stood in the doorway a moment longer, like he wasn't quite sure he was allowed. Then 2 more men came in behind him and stopped the same way, and she heard one of them say, low, "What in the... do you smell that?" And the other one didn't say anything at all. By the time all 7 men were seated at the long table, the biscuits were out of the oven, and the gravy was done, and the salt pork was crisped up, and there was enough coffee to go around twice. Eleanor set it all out without fanfare and went back to the stove, and for a long moment nobody moved. Then the gray-bearded man, his name was Walt, she had gathered, picked up a biscuit, broke it open, and looked at the steam rising from the center of it. He looked up at her. "When's the last time we had biscuits?" he asked the table. Nobody answered. He took a bite, and something in his face did something complicated and private that Eleanor didn't look at directly, because some things a person deserves to feel without being watched. The boy, Jimmy, she would learn, 17 years old and 6 months away from his mother's house in Ohio, ate 4 biscuits and 2 helpings of everything else, and looked like a different person by the time he pushed back from the table. Deke ate in silence. She noticed he took 2 biscuits and didn't comment on them. Thomas came in late, when the men were already filing back out to work. He poured himself coffee and stood at the counter and looked at the table and the empty pans. "You made biscuits," he said. "I did." "With what?" "With the flour and the lard and the buttermilk powder that was in your pantry." She started clearing the table. "I'll need to go to town today. I can get a wagon or I can walk if you'd rather. I'll take you," he said. He sounded different this morning. Something in his voice had shifted slightly, though she couldn't have said precisely what. "Thank you," Eleanor said simply. They went to town, and Eleanor Caldwell spent 4 hours in the Willow Creek General Store, while Thomas stood near the door, trying not to look like a man experiencing minor heart failure over his wife's grocery list. She knew what she was doing. She had planned every purchase, written every item down, calculated the cost against what she knew she could produce with it, and what that production would mean in terms of work output from men who were actually properly fed. She was not spending money. She was making an argument, item by item, for why this ranch could survive. "Eleanor." Thomas's voice, careful and low. "That's a 50-pound sack of flour." "I know. We need 2. She turned to the store owner. "Mr. Harley, 2 sacks of the bread flour, if you have it. And I'll need to know about your egg situation. Do you have a reliable supplier, or should I speak to someone about getting laying hens out to the ranch?" Mr. Harley blinked at her. "Ma'am, I think the Pearson farm out on the North Road has—" "Perfect. I'll stop there on the way back." She turned back to Thomas. "You'll need to trust me on this. It's a considerable amount of—" "Thomas." She kept her voice low and even, not because she was deferring to him, but because she understood that a man's pride was a fragile thing, and she had no interest in damaging it in public. "I need you to trust me. Can you do that?" He looked at her for a long moment. For a moment she thought she saw something behind his eyes, some calculation happening, some weighing of things she wasn't entirely privy to. Then he nodded. "Once. 2 sacks of flour," he told Mr. Harley. Eleanor turned back to her list. On the drive home, with the wagon bed loaded, Thomas said, "You've done this before." It wasn't quite a question. "Managed a kitchen?" "Yes." "No." A pause. "This. Run the numbers. Think it through." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "My father's farm," she said finally. "When I was 12, we had a bad year. Very bad. He was trying to figure out how to stretch what we had, and he was making every decision based on what we couldn't afford. I started tracking what we spent against what we produced and showing him where the gaps were." She watched the road. He didn't want to listen at first. What changed his mind? He got hungry enough to try a different way. Thomas said nothing for a moment. Then, unexpectedly, "How old were you when your mother died?" 8, Eleanor said. Another silence. "Mine too," he said. "I was 9. She looked at him. He was watching the road the same way she had been. She thought, there it is. There's the thing underneath everything. She didn't say it out loud, but she filed it away, the way she filed away everything that mattered, in the careful and orderly room at the back of her mind, where she kept the things she would need later. The days that followed were hard in ways Eleanor had been prepared for, and hard in ways she hadn't. She had expected the physical work. She was built for labor, had been her whole life, regardless of what people assumed when they looked at her. And the kitchen at Willow Creek, once properly stocked and organized, became her domain in a way that felt almost like relief. She understood kitchens. She understood the particular logic of cooking for many at once, the way you had to think 3 steps ahead, the way timing was everything, the way a good meal at the right moment could change the entire character of a day. What she hadn't entirely prepared for was the loneliness. Thomas was not unkind to her. He was not warm either. He spoke to her about practical things, supplies, schedules, problems that needed solving. And he was always polite, and sometimes almost thoughtful, like the coffee he'd brought her that first night without being asked. But there was a wall between them that was made of something she couldn't quite name yet. Not hostility. Something more like suspension. Like he was waiting to see what she was before he allowed himself to feel anything about it. She understood that. She was doing something similar. But understanding a thing did not make it less lonely. The ranch hands were a different story. They thawed faster than Thomas, because they ate her food 3 times a day, and the evidence was undeniable. Jimmy started saying, "Good morning, Mrs. Caldwell," in a way that sounded like he meant it. Walt, who she had learned was 58 and had been working cattle his whole life, and had hands so rough they looked like saddle leather, started leaving small things near the kitchen door. Extra firewood, once a bucket of fresh water from the well before she'd even asked, without comment. Dake remained Deke. Polite. Watchful. Not hostile exactly, but not warm either. And she noticed he paid attention to everything she did in a way that had less to do with judgment than with a kind of assessment she couldn't quite categorize. 2 weeks after she arrived, she found him in the kitchen after supper. Not doing anything, just standing there looking at the shelves. "Deke," she said. He turned. "Mrs. Caldwell. Is there something you need?" He was quiet for a moment. "The stew last night," he said. "What was in that?" She told him. He nodded slowly. "My mother made something like that. Different, but—" He stopped. "It's been a long time since anything at this table reminded me of anything." Eleanor looked at him carefully. "What was your mother's name?" "Ruth." "Where was she from?" "Georgia, originally." "Mine was from Ohio," Eleanor said. "She died when I was 8. I've been cooking from her recipes ever since." Something in Deke's face shifted. "She teach you?" "As much as she could before she went." A pause. "The rest I taught myself." He looked at her for a moment. "You're not what I expected," he said. "When Thomas said he was getting married." "No," Eleanor agreed. "I suspect I'm not." Deke almost, not quite, but almost, smiled. "The men are working harder," he said. "I don't think most of them have noticed it yet, but I have. Good food does that. It's more than the food." He looked at her directly. "It's knowing someone gives a damn." He picked up his hat from the hook near the door, nodded once, and left. Eleanor stood in the kitchen alone. She thought about what he'd said. Knowing someone gives a damn. She thought about all the years she had fed people, her father, his workers, the neighbors who came for harvests and brandings, and how she had always known that food was never only about the food. It was about being seen, about mattering, about someone doing the work to make something good for you specifically, not just because you needed fuel. She looked around the kitchen she had remade in 2 weeks. Then she picked up the supply ledger from the counter and opened it to the current page. And the numbers she found there made the warmth she'd been feeling go cold. She had known the ranch was in debt. Thomas's letters had hinted at it, and everything she'd seen in those first days had confirmed it. But she had assumed, had let herself assume, because it was more manageable that way, that the debt was significant but survivable. The kind of debt a good year could address. What she was looking at was not that kind of debt. She sat down slowly at the table. She went through the ledger from the beginning. Every entry, every number. The cattle prices from the last 3 years, each one worse than the one before. The bad season 3 years back, when half the herd was lost to a cold snap that came too early. The loan Thomas had taken to replace them, at an interest rate that had seemed reasonable then and looked cruel now. The smaller loans after that, stacked one on top of the other, each one slightly larger than the last. The banknote that was coming due in, she counted, 4 months. 4 months. She set the ledger down. She put both hands flat on the table. She had come to Willow Creek Ranch to manage a household, to cook meals, to be useful in the particular limited way that a practical arrangement required. She had not come to save a failing ranch, but she was sitting here now, in this kitchen she had rebuilt, in this house she had begun to think of as hers. Looking at numbers that said clearly, and without sentiment, that unless something fundamental changed, Thomas Caldwell was going to lose everything. And she found, somewhat to her own surprise, that she could not simply cook her meals and let that happen. She picked up the ledger again. She looked at the numbers. She began to think. Outside, the Montana wind moved through the dark grass, and the enormous sky was full of stars, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called and got no answer, and Eleanor Caldwell sat at her kitchen table with a candle burning low beside her, and thought about everything she had that could be turned into something more than it was. She thought about the wagon rotting in the back field. She thought about the mining camps she'd seen from the road coming in, 3 of them within reasonable distance, each one full of men who worked long hours and had no reliable source of hot food. She thought about what Deke had said. It's knowing someone gives a damn. And slowly, in the way that ideas arrive when you have been patient enough and desperate enough to let them, the shape of something began to form in her mind. It was risky. It was more than she had signed up for, and when she thought about how Thomas would react when she told him, her stomach tightened in a way she couldn't entirely explain, because it was not only practicality she was worried about. Somewhere in the last 2 weeks, in the coffee left without words, and the silence on the wagon road, and the conversation about their mothers, something had shifted between them in a way she hadn't planned for, and wasn't entirely sure what to do with. But the numbers in the ledger didn't care about any of that. The banknote was coming due in 4 months. And Eleanor Caldwell, who had survived a childhood without her mother, who had fed her father's household on a shoestring for years, who had come to a failing frontier ranch and rebuilt its kitchen from nothing, and begun to give 7 exhausted men back the feeling that someone gave a damn, was not a woman who let a problem sit when she could see a solution. She blew out the candle. She went to bed. Tomorrow, she would do the most frightening thing she had done since she climbed off that stagecoach. She would tell Thomas Caldwell that she needed him to trust her. Again. And this time, what she was going to ask him to trust her with was everything. She told him at breakfast. Not the full thing, not all at once. Because Eleanor had learned long ago that you didn't walk up to a proud, frightened man and drop the entire weight of an idea on him before he'd had his coffee. You started with the part he could hold. You let him get his hands around it before you showed him how big it actually was. So she waited until the men had gone out, until the table was cleared, and Thomas was on his second cup, and the morning light was coming through the east window. And then she set the ledger on the table in front of him and said simply, "I found the banknote." Thomas went very still. Not the stillness of a man caught out. More like the stillness of a man who had been waiting, without knowing he was waiting, for someone to finally say the thing out loud. He looked at the ledger. He did not touch it. "I should have told you," he said. "Yes. I thought—" He stopped. Started again. "I thought if things improved this season—" "Thomas." Eleanor sat down across from him. "I'm not here to argue about what you should have told me. I need you to look at these numbers with me." He looked at her instead of the ledger. She held his gaze and waited. Something moved through his face. Something complicated that she recognized, because she had seen it in her father's face 100 times. The particular resistance of a man who had spent so long carrying something alone that being asked to set it down felt more frightening than keeping it. Then he reached out and opened the ledger. They sat at that table for 2 hours. Eleanor walked him through every number she had found the night before, every calculation she'd done, every place where the math became impossible without something changing. She did not soften it. She did not make it easier to hear than it was. She had found, over the years, that the kindest thing you could do for someone was to tell them the truth clearly enough that they could actually act on it. Thomas listened. He asked questions, sharp ones, specific ones, the questions of a man who understood the situation better than he wanted to. He corrected 2 of her figures where she'd misread his handwriting in the ledger. He sat back and stared at the ceiling at one point for so long that she waited him out without speaking. Finally, he looked at her. 4 months, he said. 4 months. Maybe 5 if you defer the smaller payment in September, but the bank won't like it. I know what the bank likes. A pause. What do you think we should do? The question landed differently than she expected. Not what are our options. Not the careful arm's-length version. What do you think? Directed at her specifically. Like her answer mattered in a way that wasn't just polite. Eleanor had thought about this for most of the night. The kitchen, she said. He blinked. What? Not just your kitchen, a bigger one. She turned the ledger to a clean page and slid it across the table with the pencil. Let me show you. She drew it out while she explained it. Not a diagram, just numbers. The kind of numbers that told a story. The mining camps within range. The traveling crews moving through the valley with the railroad work. The other ranches whose cooks had left and hadn't been replaced. All those men, dozens of them, hundreds if you counted the camps properly, all of them eating badly or barely at all. They need food, Eleanor said. Good food, reliable food. And right now nobody is providing it. Thomas looked at the numbers on the page. You want to feed them, he said slowly. I want to sell them meals. Prepared food, delivered to the camps on a schedule they can count on. We use the ranch kitchen as the base. We fix up the old wagon in the back field. Jimmy told me it's structurally sound, just needs work. And we make it into something we can cook from on the road. Eleanor. The mining camps alone. She tapped the page. If we serve 2 camps 3 days a week and charge what I think we can reasonably charge. You've priced this out. Last night. He stared at her. You priced this out last night. I had the ledger in front of me. It seemed like the logical next step. Thomas sat back in his chair and looked at her like he was trying to solve a problem he hadn't known he had. He shook his head slightly. That is not a small thing you're describing. No, it isn't. It would take work, real work, beyond what the men are already doing. It would take supplies we don't currently have. It would take... He stopped. Where would we get the money to start it? The money from the supply run we did last week. The margins on what I've been producing in this kitchen. She showed him. Thomas, I have been spending less than the previous cook spent, and feeding the men 3 times as much useful food. The difference between what you were spending before and what you're spending now goes towards startup costs. It's not nothing. It's also not enough. Not by itself. But there's Mr. Whitmore. Thomas's jaw tightened immediately. Charles Whitmore was the name she had heard twice in 2 weeks. Once from Thomas in a context she hadn't fully understood, and once from Walt, who had used a tone that told her plenty. A supplier. The man who controlled most of the food distribution in the valley, which meant he controlled a lot more than food. Whitmore, Thomas said flatly, is not someone I want involved in anything I'm doing. I know, I'm not suggesting we work with him. Eleanor held his gaze. I'm suggesting we work around him. He's the reason the camps are underserved. His prices are too high and his quality isn't consistent. If we can offer something better at a fair price, we take that business from him. The silence that followed was different from the silences she'd learned in the last 2 weeks. This one had an edge to it. Thomas stood up from the table. He went to the window. He stood with his back to her, looking out at the ranch yard, and she watched him and waited. You understand what Whitmore does to people who cut into his business, he said quietly. I understand he doesn't like competition. That's a gentle way to put it. Thomas? She kept her voice steady. The banknote comes due in 4 months. What's the alternative? He turned around, and the look on his face, tired, cornered, something underneath it that she was only beginning to learn to read, made something ache in her chest that she didn't entirely know what to do with. You've been here 3 weeks, he said. I know. 3 weeks, and you're asking me to... He stopped. You know what you're asking me to risk? Yes. A pause. I'm asking you to risk it alongside me. He looked at her for a long, quiet moment. Why? He said. Not challenging, genuinely asking. Why does this matter to you? You could have... This wasn't what you signed up for. A bankrupt ranch, a pile of debt, a scheme that might get us both. Thomas. She stood up. You asked me, when I arrived, if I understood that this ranch needed someone who could work. He remembered. She could see it. I told you that was exactly what I came here to do. She met his eyes. I meant it. All of it. Not just the kitchen. The quiet stretched between them. Outside, she heard Jimmy calling something to one of the other men, and a horse responding somewhere near the barn, and the ordinary sounds of the ranch going about its morning. Inside the kitchen, Thomas Caldwell looked at his wife. This woman he had married out of practicality and desperation, and a letter that had been more honest than most he'd received. And something in his expression shifted in a way she couldn't quite name. The wagon in the backfield, he said finally. Yes. I'll have the men look at it today. Eleanor let out a breath she had not known she was holding. Thank you, she said. He picked up his hat from the hook near the door. Don't thank me yet, he said. Whitmore's going to hear about this inside of a week. I know. And when he does, Eleanor said quietly, we'll deal with it. Thomas looked at her one more moment. Then he put on his hat and walked out into the Montana morning, and Eleanor turned back to the kitchen, and the thing that had shifted between them stayed shifted. She was beginning to understand that was how it worked with Thomas Caldwell. Nothing big, nothing announced. Just small permanent changes, one at a time, like fence posts going in. You didn't see the fence until it was already there. The wagon took 4 days to make functional, and 2 more to make useful. Jimmy turned out to have a gift for mechanical work that nobody had bothered to notice because there had never been anything complicated enough to demand it. He and Walt pulled the wagon apart, replaced the axle, reseated the wheels, and rebuilt the side walls, while Eleanor drew up plans for what she needed inside. A way to transport prepared food safely, a small surface for finishing work on the road, storage for supplies that would stay stable in heat. She worked alongside them when the kitchen allowed it. Deke watched the whole operation from a careful distance for 2 days, and then, without being asked and without comment, started helping. Thomas said nothing about this. He watched, the way he watched most things that happened on his ranch, from a slight remove, with an expression she was learning didn't mean what she'd first thought. It wasn't detachment. It was attention of a particular kind, the kind that cataloged everything without appearing to. On the 5th day, when the wagon was taking shape into something real, he came to stand beside her, where she was reviewing her supply lists for the first run. "The Hargrove camp," he said, "north of the Creek Road. 43 men, mostly single, 6 days a week. Their current supplier is—" "Whitmore's man, I know. Mr. Harley told me." Thomas looked at her sideways. "When did you—" "I went back to the store 3 days ago for the lard. I asked around." She didn't look up from her list. "The camp foreman's name is Abe Sutter. He's been complaining about the food quality for 2 months. He'll talk to us." A pause. "You've already arranged a meeting." "Tomorrow morning. I thought you should come." She looked at him then. "If you're willing." He was quiet for a moment. "What time?" he said. 8 o'clock. He nodded once and walked away. She watched him go. The thing in her chest did the complicated thing again. She turned back to her supply list and told herself firmly to pay attention. Abe Sutter was a compact, direct man in his 40s who looked like someone had tried to make a person out of railroad iron and mostly succeeded. He met them at the edge of the Hargrove camp with his arms crossed and an expression that suggested he had heard promises before and had a very specific opinion of them. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, after Thomas introduced her. "Mr. Sutter, thank you for seeing us. Whitmore's man was by yesterday," he said immediately. "Told me you were coming. Told me some other things, too." Eleanor felt Thomas go still beside her. She kept her face easy. "What kind of things?" she asked. "That you're running an unauthorized kitchen operation. That your food handling's not up to standard." Sutter's eyes moved to her with the direct, appraising look of a man who did not particularly care about tact. "That you're not—" He paused. "That a woman in your situation hadn't ought to be taking on this kind of work." The silence that followed had a particular quality. Thomas said very quietly, "Abe, I'm repeating what I was told," Sutter said, not unkindly. "I figured she ought to hear it to her face, rather than have it working against her from behind." Eleanor looked at him steadily. "And what do you think?" she said. Sutter looked back at her. "I think," he said slowly, "that my men had burned beans and gristle for supper last night, and 3 of them spent this morning too sick to work." He uncrossed his arms. "I think Whitmore's man is worried enough about you to come out here personally. And I think worried men don't worry about things that don't matter." He nodded at her. "So I'll hear your proposal, Mrs. Caldwell." Eleanor opened her ledger. She talked for 20 minutes. She laid out the pricing, the schedule, the menu she was proposing, the supply chain she had mapped, the quality standards she was committing to. She answered every question Sutter asked, and he asked hard ones. The kind that came from a man who had been managing large groups of men in difficult conditions for years and understood exactly what could go wrong. Thomas stood beside her and said very little. But once, when Sutter pushed back hard on the delivery schedule, could she really guarantee hot food at the camp by 6 in the morning? That was a requirement, non-negotiable. The men went to shift at 6:30. Thomas said quietly, "If Eleanor says she'll have it there at 6, it'll be there at 6. Sutter looked at him, then at her. Then something in his face relaxed by about 10%, which she was already learning to read as significant. 3 days a week, Sutter said. Trial period, 1 month. If the quality's there and the schedule holds, we talk about making it permanent." Eleanor extended her hand. Sutter shook it. On the ride back to the ranch, Thomas was quiet for the first mile. Then he said, he'd already been to see Whitmore's man. Or Whitmore's man had already been to see him. Yes. That's fast. We're a threat to his margins. She kept her eyes on the road. He's going to move quickly. We need to move faster. The second camp, Thomas said. The Meridian crew, south side of the valley. I was going to ask you about them today. I know their foreman, Dan Holt. He and I. A pause. We've had our difficulties, but he's a fair man. Would he talk to us? Thomas was quiet for a moment. He'd talk to me, he said, but I think he'd rather talk to you. She looked at him. I was looking at the road, but there was something in the line of his jaw that might, on a different kind of man, have been the beginning of a smile. I see, Eleanor said. You were impressive back there. The words were said plainly, without decoration, the way Thomas said everything. But they landed with a weight she hadn't expected. I just asked questions and answered them, she said. No. He shook his head slightly. You walked into a room where a man had already been told to doubt you, and you turned it around without ever raising your voice or losing your patience. He glanced at her briefly. That's not a small thing. Eleanor looked at the road. My father, she said after a moment, used to say that the loudest person in the room was usually the most frightened. He said the most powerful thing you could do was stay quiet and let your work speak first. Sounds like a wise man. He was. She stopped. He had a hard time practicing what he preached. When things got bad, he got loud. She almost smiled. I inherited the lesson. He kept the habit. Thomas considered this. I get loud sometimes, he said. I know. He looked at her sharply. I've heard you with the men, she said mildly, when things aren't going right. He was quiet for a moment. Does that? He stopped, started differently. Is that something that concerns you? Eleanor thought about how to answer that honestly. It concerns me less than the other thing, she said. What other thing? The silence. She glanced at him. When something is very wrong, you go very quiet. That concerns me more. Thomas looked at her for a moment. Then he looked back at the road. You've been watching me, he said. I watch everyone. It's how I know what to make for supper. The surprise that crossed his face was almost, something softer than surprise. He didn't say anything else for the rest of the ride. But when they got back to the ranch and he helped her down from the wagon, he had started doing that somewhere in the last week, without announcement, just appearing at her side when they arrived somewhere. His hand held hers a half-second longer than necessary. She noticed. She was fairly sure he knew she noticed. Neither of them said a word about it. Dan Holt was nothing like Abe Sutter. Where Sutter was iron, Holt was weather, the kind of man who changed depending on what was needed. Expansive one moment, closed the next. He had the face of someone who had spent years being charming on purpose and had gotten so good at it that you could never quite tell when it was real. He greeted Thomas with the careful warmth of two men who had once been friends and had let something get between them that neither had fully resolved. He greeted Eleanor with obvious and immediate interest. Not the insulting kind, but the kind that came from someone who had already heard things about her and was deciding how much of them to believe. So you're the woman who's got Whitmore's man riding around the valley before sunup, Holt said, looking at her with something between amusement and respect. I wasn't aware he was doing that, Eleanor said. Oh, he was at the Pearson farm this morning. Holt shook his head. Tried to get them to stop selling you eggs. Pearson told him to go to hell, pardon the language, but that gives you a sense of what you're dealing with. Thomas's jaw tightened. Eleanor absorbed this. Mr. Holt, she said. How many men are in your crew? 61 currently. More coming in with the next push. And your current food situation? Holt laughed, a short, genuine sound. I'm eating Whitmore's prices and his quality and pretending both are acceptable because I don't have another option. He looked at her steadily. Until now, possibly. Eleanor laid out the proposal. Holt listened differently than Sutter had. More animated, asking questions that bounced around, jumping to conclusions and then pulling back, testing angles. She matched his rhythm, staying with him when he jumped, grounding him when he got ahead of the data. At one point he turned to Thomas and said, "Where did you find her?" Thomas said, without missing a beat, "Helena paper." "I need to start reading the Helena paper more carefully." "Probably," Thomas agreed. Eleanor kept her expression neutral and continued with the pricing structure. By the end of the meeting, Holt had committed to a 4-day-a-week arrangement, pending the same 1-month trial Sutter had proposed. He shook Eleanor's hand, and then Thomas's, and then he said, in the straightforward way of a man who had decided something, "Whitmore's going to come at you hard, Mrs. Caldwell." "So everyone keeps telling me." "They're telling you because it's true. He's got pull with the county. The kind of pull that shows up in inspections and permits and small legal difficulties that appear from nowhere." "I appreciate the warning." Holt nodded. Then he looked at Thomas. "She's something, Tom." Thomas looked at his wife. "Yeah," he said quietly. "She is." Eleanor felt heat come up in her face and was furious at herself for it. She turned back to her ledger with great purpose. On the road home, neither of them talked about what Holt had said. But the air between them was different, closer, like a temperature change, slight, undeniable. She focused very hard on the supply calculations she was reviewing in her head for the first run, which was now 4 days away, and which represented a logistical challenge that was significantly easier to think about than the man sitting 2 feet from her on the wagon bench. The first run was on a Thursday. Eleanor was up at 3 in the morning. She had prepped everything she could the night before, the large pots of stew made to a point where they needed 2 more hours of heat, the biscuit dough ready to be rolled and cut, the coffee supplies packed and inventoried. She had gone to bed at 10 o'clock, which was the most intentional sleep schedule she had maintained in years, and she had lain there for 40 minutes thinking about timing and logistics before sleep finally took her. Jimmy was at the kitchen door at 3:15, already awake, already dressed. "I thought you might need an extra hand," he said. Eleanor looked at him. He was trying to look casual. He mostly succeeded. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "No, ma'am." He shifted slightly. "I wanted to." She held the door open. "The biscuit dough is in the cold chest. You can start rolling while I get the stove temperature up." He came in and went straight to work, and she thought about what it meant. This boy, far from his mother, 6 months into the hardest job he'd probably ever done, up at 3 in the morning because he wanted to help. And she felt that same thing she'd felt when Walt broke open his first biscuit and did something private with his face. She was not just cooking food. She was doing something else, something that didn't have a clean name, and the fact that she couldn't name it didn't make it less real. By 4:30, Deke appeared. Then Walt. Then the other 4 men in a loose cluster, pulling on coats, carrying things without being asked. Thomas was last. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at his 7 ranch hands all working around his wife's kitchen in the pre-dawn dark, and the expression on his face was one she had not seen on him before. She turned away before she could think too hard about it. "We leave in 30 minutes, she said to the room. "Let's make sure we're ready." They were ready in 25. The wagon loaded, the pot secured, the biscuits wrapped and packed, the coffee in sealed containers that would hold heat for 2 hours. Eleanor climbed up to the driver's bench. She had driven wagons her whole life and had never seen a reason to pretend otherwise, and looked back at the ranch hands who were loading the last of the supplies. Thomas appeared beside the wagon. "I'll ride alongside," he said, "in case of trouble on the road." She looked at him. "You don't have to." "I know." He met her eyes. "I want to." The word landed the same way it had when Jimmy had said it at the door. "I wanted to." She looked away. "All right," she said. "Let's go." They reached the Hargrove camp at 5:47, 13 minutes early. Eleanor had planned for 13 minutes of setup time, which meant by 6 o'clock, when the camp began to stir and the first bleary-eyed miners stumbled toward the smell that was already working its way through the cold morning air, there was hot food waiting. She watched the first man stop. Blink. Look at the wagon, at the pots, at the woman standing behind it with a ladle. "Ma'am?" he said, uncertain. "Breakfast," Eleanor said. "Beef stew and biscuits. Coffee's over there." He stared at her for another second. Then he held out his tin plate. Within 20 minutes, there were 40 men in line. Within 40 minutes, Abe Sutter was standing next to Eleanor watching his crew eat with an expression that she categorized as vindicated. "Told Whitmore's man you'd be here by 6, he said. "What did he say?" "That it wasn't possible." A pause. "He said a lot of things that weren't possible, as it turns out." Eleanor refilled the ladle. "You'll see us Thursday and Saturday going forward. Then Sunday, once we sort out the Sunday prep schedule." She glanced at him. "Unless you'd prefer a different arrangement." "Whatever keeps that stew coming," Sutter said. She was back at the ranch by 9 o'clock. The men who'd stayed behind had coffee waiting. Thomas unsaddled his horse himself and came to find her in the kitchen, where she was already working on a post-run inventory. What had been consumed? What was left? What she needed to adjust for the Meridian Camp run on Saturday. "Well," he said, 43 men, all fed, no food left over." She looked up. "The margin, after costs, is—" She turned the ledger. "Here." Thomas looked at the number. He looked at her. "That's from one run," he said. "From one run, to one camp, on our first day." She held his gaze. "Thomas, in 1 month at this rate—" "I can do the math," he said quietly. She waited. He looked at the ledger for a long moment. Then he looked up. "You knew," he said, not accusing, almost wondering. "You knew this was what it could be." "I knew it was possible. I didn't know until today if it was real." He nodded slowly, and then, unexpectedly, he pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. Not to look at the ledger, just to sit. Like a man who had been standing for so long that he had forgotten sitting was an option. "My father built this ranch," he said, 40 years ago, when there was nothing here. Just grass and sky and him." He was quiet for a moment. "I used to think the hardest thing would be keeping it going. Now I think—" He stopped. "What do you think?" she asked carefully. He looked at her. "I think the hardest thing might have been trying to keep it going alone." The words sat between them. Eleanor kept her face still and her breathing even and told herself very firmly that a practical arrangement between two people was what it was, and that reading things into a tired man's honesty was not something she was going to do. She looked back at the ledger. "The Saturday run," she said. "I'll need your help with the loading." "You'll have it," Thomas said. His voice was quieter than usual. Neither of them moved for a moment. Outside, Jimmy was telling one of the other men something in a voice she could hear but not quite make out, and the sound of the ranch going about its afternoon came through the walls, ordinary and alive, and in the kitchen it was just the two of them, and the numbers on the page, and the thing between them that neither had named. Then Thomas stood up. He picked up his hat. "I'll go check on the south fence line," he said. "All right." He walked toward the door, stopped. "Eleanor." She looked up. "Good work today," he said. Quietly. Directly. The way he said everything that mattered. She held his gaze. "Thank you, Thomas." He nodded once, and walked out. Eleanor looked at the empty doorway for one moment. Just one. And then she looked down at the ledger, and she thought about the banknote due in 4 months, and she thought about 43 men eating breakfast in the cold Montana morning, and she thought about a man who had been trying to keep something alive alone for a very long time. She picked up her pencil. She started on the Saturday calculations. And somewhere across the valley, though she didn't know it yet, Charles Whitmore was sitting in his office looking at a report his man had brought him about a woman with a wagon and a ladle who had shown up at the Hargrove camp 13 minutes early and fed 43 men without a single scrap left over, and his expression was the expression of a man who had underestimated something and was not happy about it. He picked up his pen. He began to write a letter, and the thing he was setting in motion would reach Eleanor Caldwell's kitchen inside of a week, and when it did, it would be the hardest thing she had faced since she arrived at Willow Creek Ranch. Not because it was stronger than her, but because it would come at her from the one direction she hadn't thought to guard. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It came with the regular mail delivery from town, tucked between a seed catalog Thomas had not ordered and a notice from the county land office about something unrelated. Plain envelope. No return address. Eleanor's name written on in the careful, deliberate hand of someone who had thought about each letter before committing it to paper. She opened it at the kitchen table after the men had gone out to work. She read it twice. Then she set it down, very carefully, and looked at the wall. The letter was from the County Health and Commerce Office. It informed her, in the polite and entirely impersonal language of official correspondence, that a complaint had been filed regarding the operation of an unlicensed food service enterprise operating out of Willow Creek Ranch. It further informed her that an inspector would be visiting the premises within 10 days to assess compliance with county health standards, and that failure to meet those standards would result in an immediate cease of operations and potential financial penalties. It was signed by a deputy commissioner whose name she did not recognize. But at the bottom of the page, in a different hand, smaller, tighter, the handwriting of someone who wanted to make sure the message was received, someone had added 4 words. "This is just beginning." Eleanor folded the letter. She put it in her apron pocket. She went back to the stove and finished the morning prep, because the men needed lunch and the world did not stop turning because someone had decided to come at her sideways. But her hands, for the first time in weeks, were not entirely steady. She did not tell Thomas at lunch. She told herself it was because she needed to think it through first, which was true. She told herself it was because she didn't want to alarm him before she had something useful to say about it, which was also true. She told herself it was not because she was afraid of what she would see in his face when he read those 4 words at the bottom, which was less true. She had built something in the last month. Not just the kitchen enterprise, that too, but more than that. She had built a kind of equilibrium with Thomas Caldwell, a working understanding that had started as 2 people solving a problem together and had become something she didn't have a clean name for yet. Something that felt fragile. Not in a bad way. Fragile the way new things were fragile. The way you handled something carefully, not because it was weak, but because it mattered. She did not want to watch his face close the way it had closed that first morning when she'd shown him the ledger. She did not want him to look at her and see, behind everything she'd built, the liability that she apparently was. The target that Whitmore had apparently decided she'd become. "A woman in your situation," Holt had quoted. That was what Whitmore's man had said to Sutter. A woman in your situation. She knew exactly what situation they meant. She had known her whole life exactly what situation they meant. She had spent her whole life either fighting that sentence or walking away from it, and she was tired. God, she was tired of that particular fight. But she was not done with it, and she was not going to let a letter with 4 extra words at the bottom undo what she had spent a month building. So she thought. She thought through lunch, and through the afternoon prep, and through a quiet hour she spent at the kitchen table with a fresh ledger page, mapping out what an inspector would look at and what they would find, and what, if Whitmore had any real pull with whoever he'd gotten to write that letter, they might decide to find regardless of what was actually there. By supper, she had a list. By the time Thomas came in from the south pasture with mud on his boots and the particular exhausted set to his shoulders, that meant a long day had gotten longer, she was ready. She put his plate in front of him. She sat down across from him. She set the letter on the table between them. Thomas looked at it, looked at her, picked it up and read it. She watched him read it twice, the same way she had. She watched his jaw set. She watched him get to the bottom and read those 4 words. And she watched his face do something controlled and very quiet that she understood now was his version of a storm. He set the letter down. "When did this come?" he said. "Today's mail." "Why didn't you—" He stopped himself. "I needed to think first." He looked at her for a moment. "What did you decide?" he said. She turned the ledger page around and slid it across the table. "I made a list of everything an inspector could legitimately cite us for, and what it would take to address each item before the 10-day window closes." She tapped the page. "Most of it we can handle ourselves. The storage situation in the back pantry needs work. I want a proper cold room if we can manage it, or at minimum a secured dry storage that can't be questioned. The wagon needs documentation as a food transport vehicle. And I want Dr. Hennessy from town to do a voluntary inspection of the kitchen before the county inspector arrives. Thomas blinked. You want to invite a doctor to inspect us before the inspector inspects us? I want a credible witness on record who will testify, if it comes to that this kitchen exceeds the standards of the county code. She held his gaze. Whitmore has pull with the county office. Fine. We make it so that any inspector who comes here and tries to cite us for something that isn't there has to do it in front of a documented record that says otherwise. Thomas looked at the list. He looked at her. You thought about this all day, he said. Yes. While you cooked lunch. I'm capable of thinking while I cook. Something moved through his expression. Not quite what she'd been afraid of. Something harder to categorize, more complicated. Eleanor, he said. Thomas, I should have told you about Whitmore, before, what he was capable of. He set his hands flat on the table. When I told you he wouldn't like competition, I was minimizing it. I knew then that this was likely. I didn't tell you because... He stopped. Because you were afraid I'd say no, she said quietly. He met her eyes. Because I was afraid you'd be right to say no, he said. The honesty of it sat in the air between them. Thomas. She kept her voice even. I am a grown woman who has been handling difficult situations since I was 8 years old. The next time you decide not to tell me something to protect me from it, I'd like you to remember that. His jaw worked slightly. Understood, he said. Good. She picked up her fork. Now eat your supper before it gets cold. We have a cold room to figure out how to build. He looked at her for one more moment, and then, finally, unmistakably, the corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile. Thomas Caldwell did not traffic in smiles easily, but it was close. He picked up his fork. Yes, ma'am, he said. She looked back at the plate before he could see what her face did in response to that. The next 6 days were the hardest work Eleanor had done since she arrived at Willow Creek Ranch, and that was saying something. Thomas mobilized the men the following morning with a directness that she was coming to recognize as his particular leadership style. Not loud, not elaborate, just clear and specific and utterly confident that it would be done, which meant it was done. Walt and 2 of the other hands started work on the cold storage room within the hour. Jimmy took the wagon to town with a list Eleanor had prepared and came back with the supplies she needed and a piece of information she hadn't sent him for. Whitmore's man was at the general store when I got there, Jimmy said, unloading the wagon in the kitchen yard. Mr. Harley told me he'd been asking questions about our supply orders, how much we'd bought, what kind of quantities. Eleanor straightened up. Did Mr. Harley tell him? Jimmy's expression answered the question before he did. Mr. Harley told him that his customers' purchasing habits were their own business, and that if Whitmore's man wanted to shop somewhere else, that was his God-given right, and he was welcome to exercise it. A pause. I wasn't very polite about it. Good, Eleanor said. She went back to her inventory, but something cold was moving through her. Whitmore was mapping her supply chain, which meant he was looking for a pressure point, a supplier he could lean on, a source he could cut off, something that would compromise her operation, not through legal channels, but through the simpler, older method of controlling what she could get her hands on. She needed to diversify, faster than she'd planned. She spent that night at the kitchen table with a map of the valley. Thomas's map, pulled from the desk in his office, spread across the table with her supply ledger beside it. She marked every farm within a day's wagon ride, every potential supplier who was not already tied to Whitmore's distribution network, every source of meat, grain, eggs, vegetables, dairy. There were more than she'd expected. Montana, in 1885, was a territory filling up fast, and fast-filling territories bred independent-minded people who did not like being told who they could and couldn't sell to. The same frontier spirit that made life hard made cooperation possible in ways that older, more settled places didn't always manage. She made a list of names. She went to bed at midnight. She was back up at 4. Thomas found her at the table before dawn, which was not unusual anymore. He had developed the habit of coming to the kitchen first thing, ostensibly for coffee, in a way that she suspected had as much to do with who was in the kitchen as with the coffee. She had not said anything about this. She wasn't sure what she would say. He looked at the map. He looked at the list. "I know the Pearson farm," he said, sitting down. "And the Malone place on the East Road. Good people, both of them. Would they work with us?" "The Pearsons already are. They've been selling us eggs." He pulled the map slightly closer. "Malone grows wheat. He's been trying to find buyers outside Whitmore's network for 2 years. He'd talk to you." "Can we go today?" Thomas looked up from the map. "I'll send word this morning," he said. She nodded, going back to the list. "Eleanor." His voice was quiet. She looked up. I was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Something careful in it. Something that had been building for days and was perhaps getting too large to keep contained. "You haven't slept more than 5 hours in 3 nights, he said. "I'm fine." "I know you're fine. That's not what I—" He stopped. "I'm asking you not to run yourself into the ground. The ranch needs you functional." It was the right thing to say. The practical, sensible thing. The thing a man in a practical arrangement said to the woman managing the practical parts. She knew he meant it differently than it sounded. She knew it because of the way he was looking at her. "I'll sleep when the inspection is done," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. "After the inspection," he said, "you're taking a full day off. I'll cook if I have to. You'll frighten the men. Then they'll appreciate you more." He stood up, picked up his coffee. "I'm serious, Eleanor." "I know you are." He looked at her one more moment. Then he went out to start the day. She looked at the doorway he'd left through. She thought, this is a problem. She thought, or possibly it is the opposite of a problem. She thought, either way, it is something to deal with later, when the inspection is survived and the bank note is addressed and there is room to think about something other than logistics. She picked up her pencil and went back to the list. Dr. James Hennessy arrived at Willow Creek Ranch 2 days before the county inspector was scheduled to appear. He was a small, precise man of perhaps 60, who carried a leather bag that had seen 20 years of frontier medicine, and an expression that suggested he had heard most possible claims about most possible situations, and had arrived at a settled, evidence-based opinion of humanity. He shook Eleanor's hand with the brisk efficiency of someone who did not perform warmth, but possessed something better. Genuine attention. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "I've had 4 men from the Hargrove camp tell me your beef stew is the reason they've been healthy this month. That's a more enthusiastic testimonial than I usually get for my actual medical treatments." Eleanor almost smiled. "How can I help you feel better about that, Dr. Hennessy?" "Show me your kitchen," he said. She showed him everything. Every shelf, every storage area, every procedure she had instituted for food handling. How meat was stored, how produce was checked, how the wagon was cleaned between runs, how she tracked what went out and when. She explained her supply chain, her preparation schedule, her standards for what was used and what was discarded. Hennessy asked sharp questions throughout. Technical questions, some of them. The kind that suggested he had more than passing familiarity with food safety. He opened containers, checked temperatures, looked at her storage system with the careful eyes of a man who knew what he was looking for. Thomas stood in the kitchen doorway for part of this, arms crossed, saying nothing. She could feel him watching, not her exactly. Watching Hennessy, watching for something. At the end of an hour and a half, Hennessy closed his bag. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "in my 30 years of practice in this territory, I have inspected the food operations of 3 separate Army installations, 2 large cattle operations, and the kitchen at the county courthouse." He paused. "Yours is cleaner than all of them." Eleanor felt something release in her chest. "Would you be willing to put that in writing?" she asked. "I already have," he said, and pulled a folded document from his bag. "Signed, dated, witnessed by my assistant before I left town. I thought you might need it." She took the document. She looked at it. "Thank you," she said. It was inadequate. She knew it was inadequate. But Hennessy waved it off with the gesture of a man who did things because they were right, and did not need to be thanked for it. "You're doing good work out here," he said quietly. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." He picked up his bag. "And the stew," he added at the door. "I wouldn't say no to a bowl before I ride back." She fed him stew and biscuits and sent him home with a jar of preserves she'd put up the week before from the wild plums she'd found growing along the creek. Thomas walked him to his horse, and she watched from the kitchen window as the two men spoke briefly, and whatever Thomas said made Hennessy nod slowly and look back at the house with an expression she couldn't read from the distance. She turned back to the kitchen. 2 days. 2 days until the inspector came. She was ready. She thought she was ready. The morning of the inspection, Charles Whitmore came himself. She had not expected that. She had expected his inspector, had expected a county official, perhaps compromised, perhaps not, doing a job that Whitmore had arranged to make difficult. She had not expected the man himself to drive up in his expensive buggy at 9 in the morning, with the county inspector sitting beside him, and the expression of someone who had already decided how this was going to go. Thomas was in the barn when they arrived. Eleanor was at the kitchen door when the buggy stopped in the yard. She had seen Whitmore from a distance once, in town, and had formed an impression. A large man, well-dressed in the way of someone who used clothing, red-faced, confident in the absolute way of men who had not been wrong often enough to develop any humility about it. Up close, he was all of that, and one thing more. He was furious, not showing it. He was too controlled for that, too practiced. But she had spent her life reading people, and she could see it underneath the pleasant expression, the way you could see fire under ice if the ice was thin enough. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, stepping down. "I wanted to come and see the operation everyone's been talking about." "Mr. Whitmore," she kept her voice level. "I wasn't aware you'd be accompanying the inspector." "Oh, I try to stay involved in community affairs," he smiled. "This is Mr. Garfield, from the county office." Garfield was a thin, nervous man who shook her hand without meeting her eyes, which told her something significant about the nature of his involvement in this visit. "Of course," Eleanor said. "Please come in." She had thought, in the hours before they arrived, about how she would handle this moment. She had considered anger. She had the right to it. She had considered cold formality. She had considered preemptive offense, going at them before they could come at her. She had rejected all of it. She had decided on something her father had taught her, though he'd never framed it as a lesson. Something she'd learned from watching him. The most unsettling thing you could do to a man who expected you to fight or crumble was to do neither. You simply did the thing. You were simply exactly what you were. You made it so that attacking you required attacking something that was unambiguously good, and you let the attacker deal with what that made him look like. So she showed them the kitchen. Everything. In exactly the same order she'd shown Hennessy, with the same precision, the same thoroughness. She answered every question Garfield asked, and he asked real questions, she noticed, technical ones, the kind that suggested that whatever Whitmore had arranged, Garfield himself was actually doing his job alongside the arrangement. She produced the Hennessy document. She produced her supply records. She produced the logs she'd been keeping of every food run, every quantity, every temperature check. Whitmore stood to one side and said nothing through most of this, which was, she realized, because he was looking for something. He was waiting for the gap, the thing she'd missed, the oversight that would give Garfield legitimate cause to cite her. She had not left one. She knew it, and after 20 minutes, she could see that he was beginning to know it too. The fury underneath the ice got thinner, and then Thomas walked in. He came in from the back door, having apparently finished in the barn, and stopped when he saw Whitmore. Something happened in the room. A change in the air, immediate and unmistakable, the way atmosphere changed before a storm. The two men looked at each other. Eleanor had known they had history. She had known it was complicated. She had not known, until this moment, exactly how complicated, because the look that passed between Thomas Caldwell and Charles Whitmore in her kitchen was the look of two men who had a long-standing score and had never fully settled it. "Tom," Whitmore said. "Charles," Thomas said. His voice was flat. Not angry. Controlled beyond anger, which was a different thing and more dangerous. I heard your wife was running quite an operation out here, Whitmore said, with the particular kind of pleasantness that was designed to produce the opposite effect in its target. You heard right. Just wanted to make sure everything was above board. Thomas looked at him for a long moment. I think you'll find it is, he said. Garfield, caught between them, made a small uncomfortable movement. Eleanor said calmly, Mr. Garfield, if you'd like to see the cold storage, I can show you that as well. We just completed it last week. Garfield looked at her with something that might have been relief. Yes, he said. Thank you, Mrs. Caldwell. She led him out. She did not look at Thomas. She did not look at Whitmore. But she heard, very clearly, through the kitchen wall, as she showed Garfield the cold storage, the sound of two voices. Thomas's, low and measured, and Whitmore's, the pleasantness stripped away now that there was no audience, speaking with an intensity she could feel from 10 feet away without being able to make out the words. Garfield looked at the cold storage. He looked at the documentation she had prepared. He looked at the Hennessy letter. He looked finally at her. Mrs. Caldwell, he said quietly, I need you to understand that the nature of this inspection was. He stopped. He was a man who was doing something that required more courage than his face suggested he had, and she watched him find it. The complaint that was filed was not specific to any documented issue. I want you to know that. Eleanor looked at him steadily. I appreciate you telling me, she said. Your operation is. He cleared his throat. I have no basis for any citation. She let out a breath. Thank you, Mr. Garfield. He nodded, looked at the door. I should. Of course. She walked him back to the kitchen. Whitmore was standing near the door. Thomas was at the far side of the room, near the stove, and she could see from the set of his shoulders that whatever had been said between them had not been small. Garfield spoke very briefly to Whitmore. Whatever he said made the red in Whitmore's face deepen. Whitmore looked at Eleanor. She held his gaze. And for the first time since his buggy had pulled into the yard, she let him see something true in her face. Not anger, not triumph, not fear. Just a woman who had built something real and was not going to apologize for it and was not going to stop. Mrs. Caldwell, he said very softly. Mr. Whitmore, she replied. He looked at her for one long moment. Then he put on his hat and walked out. Garfield followed. The buggy drove away. The kitchen was very quiet. Then Thomas said, from across the room, Eleanor. She turned. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on him before. Not complicated, simple, which was rarer on his face. Clear in a way that most of his expressions weren't. She felt something happen in her chest that she was not entirely prepared for. Are you all right? He asked. I'm fine, she said. Then, no. She stopped. She was shaking slightly. She noticed it as if from a distance. Her hands, which were perfectly steady when they needed to be, and were now apparently done needing to be. The reaction she had not allowed herself during the inspection because she could not afford it. Thomas crossed the kitchen in 3 steps. He did not take her hands. He did not touch her at all. He simply stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, and said nothing, which was exactly the right thing. She breathed. She steadied. He's not done, she said. No, Thomas agreed. He's not. He'll find another angle. He will. She looked up at him. You know him, she said. The two of you. What happened between you? Thomas was quiet for a moment. He made an offer on this ranch, he said. 2 years ago when things were bad. A low offer, insultingly low. He paused. And when I turned it down, he made sure things got worse. Eleanor stared at him. He cut you off from his supply network, she said slowly. Among other things. That's why the supplies were so poor when I arrived. He made it difficult for us to get competitive prices from any supplier he had influence with. Thomas's voice was flat, factual, the tone of a man who had arranged his bitterness into something he could manage. I was surviving it, barely. And then I showed up and started cutting into his camp's business. and built an independent supply chain in 2 weeks that bypassed his network entirely. For the first time, something almost like satisfaction edged his voice. He didn't expect that. Eleanor looked at him. Thomas, when you said this is just beginning, those words at the bottom of the letter, I've seen his handwriting before, Thomas said quietly. Yes. The word landed in the kitchen like a stone dropped in still water. He had known. He had known whose handwriting it was when he read that letter, and he had sat at the supper table and looked at her list and said, "We have a cold room to figure out how to build," and helped her do exactly that. "You should have told me," she said. "Yes. Thomas, I know." He met her eyes. I didn't want you to be afraid." "I'm not afraid of him." "I know that now." He held her gaze. "I didn't know it then the way I know it now." The difference in those two sentences, then and now, was something she felt rather than analyzed. She looked at him. I was close, still. And the expression on his face was the clearest she had ever seen it. No wall, no suspension, no careful distance. Just Thomas. Just a man standing in her kitchen, looking at her like she was something he had not known how to want before and was working out whether he was allowed to. She was the one who looked away, because she was not ready. Not yet. Not with Whitmore still in motion, and the banknote still due and 4 months of work still ahead. Not ready to stand here in this kitchen and look at Thomas Caldwell looking at her like that and figure out what it meant and what she was going to do about it. "I need to start the lunch prep," she said. His exhale was quiet. "Of course," he said. He stepped back. He picked up his hat. He was almost to the door when she said, "Thomas?" He stopped. She turned. "What did you say to him?" she asked. "When Garfield and I were in the back, what did you say?" Thomas looked at her. "I told him," he said quietly, "that the next time he came to my ranch uninvited, he would leave a great deal less comfortably than he arrived. And?" A pause. "And I told him that my wife had built something that was going to outlast every threat he could come up with, and that if he had any intelligence at all, he would find something better to do with his time." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "Thank you," she said. Thomas nodded once, and walked out. She stood in the kitchen. Outside, she could hear the ordinary sounds of the ranch. Men working, horses moving, the Montana wind in the dry grass. The sounds of a place that was alive. That was staying alive, against the odds, because enough people had decided it mattered. She turned to the stove. She got the fire up. She started the lunch prep. And while she worked, she turned over the thing that was sitting in the center of her chest. Not the inspection. Not Whitmore. Not the banknote. The other thing. The thing she had been carefully not naming for 3 weeks because there had always been something more urgent to deal with. Deke came in for something just before noon. He stopped when he looked at her face. He had always been perceptive, Deke. It was what she'd respected about him from the beginning, under the wariness. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine," she said. He looked at her for a moment. "He told Whitmore off," Deke said. "I was near the window. Didn't hear everything, but I heard enough." Eleanor kept her eyes on the stove. "I know," she said. "Thomas doesn't—" Deke paused, choosing words with unusual care. "He doesn't speak up for people easily. It costs him something, always has." Another pause. "I've worked for him 8 years. I've seen him angry. I've seen him desperate. I've seen him every kind of tired there is." He was quiet for a moment. "I've never seen him look at anybody the way he looks at you." Eleanor's hand stilled on the pot handle. She said nothing. Deke picked up whatever he'd come in for and went back out. And Eleanor stood at the stove with the lunch bubbling, and the Montana wind pushing at the walls, and the sound of her own heartbeat a little louder than usual. And she thought about a man who had been keeping something alive alone for a very long time. She thought about fence posts, about how you didn't see the fence until it was already there. She picked up the ladle. She kept cooking. And somewhere in the valley, in the 3 mining camps and 2 ranch outposts where men had started building their days around a wagon that showed up on time with food that tasted like something that mattered, the word continued to spread. Quietly, the way true things spread. Not with noise, but with weight. And in Whitmore's office, a man who had expected to walk into a failing kitchen, operated by a woman everyone had told him he could easily destroy, was sitting with a county inspector's negative report and a cold, specific anger, turning over his remaining options. He still had them, not as many as before, but he had one he hadn't used yet. One that didn't require inspectors or legal letters. One that went at the heart of the thing, and he was already making the arrangements. Whitmore's next move came not through an official letter, not through an inspector, not through any channel that Eleanor could have prepared a document against. It came through people. Specifically, it came through the wives. Eleanor first noticed it on a Wednesday, 6 days after the inspection. She had driven the wagon into Willow Creek to pick up supplies from Harley's store, the same run she made every week, the same route, the same familiar faces. But something was different that morning. Small things. The kind of small things that a woman who had spent her life reading rooms noticed immediately, even when she couldn't have said exactly what had changed. Mrs. Garber, who ran the dry goods counter at Harley's and had started greeting Eleanor by name 3 weeks ago, was suddenly busy with something behind the counter when Eleanor came through the door. She helped her, but she didn't look at her the same way. There was a quality to her attention that had shifted. A carefulness, a distance, like someone who had received information recently and was still working out what to do with it. At the post office, where she stopped to send a letter to a flour supplier in Helena, the postmaster's wife, who had once asked Eleanor for her biscuit recipe, who had said she'd been hearing wonderful things from her husband's brother who worked at the Hargrove camp, said nothing. Looked somewhere past her shoulder. Processed the letter efficiently, and wished her good day with the politeness of a woman who had decided something. And in front of the mercantile, where Eleanor tied the wagon while she finished her list, she heard it directly for the first time. 2 women. Standing near enough that Eleanor could not pretend she didn't hear. Possibly not pretending she couldn't hear on purpose. She would never know for certain. One of them said, just clearly enough, "My husband says she is running some kind of commercial operation out of the Caldwell Ranch, that she's not, well, it's not what a wife does, is it? All those men, all those camps." And the other one said carefully, "I heard she was a mail order arrangement. Thomas didn't know her at all." No, and it shows, doesn't it? A respectable woman would be managing the house, not driving a wagon around the county at all hours. Eleanor stood with her hand on the wagon side and did not turn around. She breathed in. She breathed out. She untied the wagon, climbed up, and drove back to the ranch. She did not shake this time. She noticed that. The shaking was apparently reserved for legal threats and not for social ones, which told her something about where her particular vulnerabilities lay. She had dealt with social threats before. She had dealt with them her whole life. She was the girl who was too heavy. She was the woman who was not what a wife was supposed to look like. She was the woman everyone had an opinion about before she spoke her first word. She knew how rumors worked, how they spread, how they gathered weight that had nothing to do with truth and everything to do with who was doing the spreading and how much social pull they had behind them. Whitmore had a great deal of social pull. She had not considered that vector. She should have. By the time she got back to the ranch, she had considered it thoroughly and arrived at the place she always arrived when she thought about being targeted in that particular way. Not despair, not surrender, but a cold, specific anger that she found useful because it cut through everything soft and left only the clear shape of what needed to be done. She told Thomas that evening. She had considered not telling him, had spent 3 miles of road debating it, and had decided against that instinct with the same firmness she'd have applied to anything she recognized as fear-based. She had told him explicitly that she expected honesty. She could not then fail to practice it. She laid it out plainly. What she'd seen in the store, what she'd heard in front of the mercantile, the pattern underneath it, which was, Whitmore was going after her reputation not as a businesswoman, but as a wife, because that was the more vulnerable surface, the one a county inspector couldn't defend against. Thomas listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she began to prepare herself for whatever was coming. The doubts, the complications, the perhaps we should reconsider that a man might reasonably arrive at when his practical arrangement had become a social liability. Then he said, "Who was it? In front of the mercantile." "I didn't see their faces." "Did you recognize the voices?" Thomas: "I'm asking because if I know who's carrying his water, I know where the conversation started." "He was not loud. He was the opposite of loud. This is a small town. Rumors have sources. If we find the source, we find out what he's actually saying." Eleanor looked at him. This was not the response she had prepared for. "What difference does it make what he's actually saying?" she asked. "All the difference." Thomas leaned forward. "If he's telling people you're running an unsafe operation, we respond with Hennessy's letter. If he's telling people you're financially destroying me, we respond with the ledger. If he's telling people—" He stopped. Something tightened in his jaw. "If what those women were saying is what he's actually saying, that there's something improper about the work you're doing, then we respond to that differently." "How?" she said. "How do you respond to that particular lie?" Thomas met her eyes. "You don't," he said quietly. "You let me respond to it." She looked at him. "Thomas, Eleanor." His voice had the quality she had come to recognize as his most serious register. Quiet, direct, no space in it for argument. "Let me be clear about something. You came to this ranch, and in 6 weeks, you have done more for it than I managed in 2 years alone. You have fed my men and saved my finances and out-organized a county inspection and started a business that is giving us a path out of a debt I had begun to believe was permanent." He held her gaze. "If someone in this town wants to suggest that there is something improper about the woman who did all of that, they are going to have to say it to my face. And they are going to have to explain to me and to everyone listening exactly what they mean." The kitchen was very quiet. Eleanor said carefully, "You don't have to fight my battles." "No," Thomas agreed. "I don't have to." He paused. "I want to." 3 words. The same 3 words Jimmy had used at the kitchen door, that first pre-dawn morning. The same words Thomas himself had used about riding alongside the wagon. "I want to." She looked at him. He looked back at her steadily, the way he always did when something mattered. She thought, "You fool, Eleanor. You absolute fool. Look at what is sitting right across this table from you." She said, "All right." He nodded. "Good," he said. "Now, the Malone flour delivery is Thursday. I was thinking we expand the Sunday run to include the 3rd camp, the Kelsey operation. What do you know about their foreman?" Eleanor blinked. Then she almost laughed. Not at him, at herself, at the whiplash of it. The perfectly Thomas way of having a moment and then moving directly back to the work, because there was always work. She picked up her ledger. She told him what she knew about the Kelsey operations foreman. They worked until 10 o'clock. What Thomas did the following morning was something Eleanor heard about in pieces, from different sources, over the course of 2 days. He had ridden into Willow Creek after the morning chores. He had gone first to the barber shop, which in a town the size of Willow Creek was the male equivalent of a social center, and he had sat in the chair and had his hair cut and had spoken, in his quiet, direct way, to whoever was there. He had said, and here the accounts varied in their particulars, but not in their substance, that his wife was running the most organized food operation in the valley, that she had the documented endorsement of Dr. Hennessy, that she had passed a county inspection without a single citation, and that any man who had something to say about Eleanor Caldwell and her work was welcome to come to Willow Creek Ranch and say it directly to Thomas Caldwell's face, at which point Thomas Caldwell would be very interested to hear his reasoning. He had then gone to the dry goods counter at Harley's and said approximately the same thing to Mrs. Garber, in a tone that was, by all accounts, perfectly respectful and left absolutely no room for misunderstanding. And then he had gone to Whitmore's supply office on the edge of town. This part Eleanor heard from Dan Holt, who had apparently been present by chance and had provided her, when he stopped by the ranch 2 days later, with an account that he delivered with the expression of a man who had found the entire episode deeply satisfying. Tom walked in, Holt said, and Whitmore was behind his desk, and Tom said, "I want to be accurate here." He said, The next rumor about my wife that comes out of this office will be the last business you do in this valley. I have spoken to the Pearson farm, the Malone place, the Hargrove camp, the Meridian crew, and the Kelsey operation this week. Every one of them has committed to continuing business with Willow Creek Ranch, regardless of what pressure you apply. You are welcome to spend your time and resources trying to damage my wife's reputation, or you are welcome to accept that she has built something you cannot touch. But I advise you to choose, because I will not be having this conversation twice." Holt paused. "And then Tom put on his hat and left," he finished. Whitmore didn't say a single word. Eleanor sat with this for a moment. "He spoke to all of them?" she said. "The Pearson farm and the Malones and—" "In one morning," Holt confirmed. "I checked. The man covered about 14 miles before noon." Eleanor looked at her hands on the table. Holt watched her with the perceptive look of a man who understood what he was looking at. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said carefully, "how's the ranch?" She looked up. "It's good," she said. "It's—" She stopped. "It's good." Holt nodded slowly. "Good," he said, and left it there. That evening, Eleanor was at the stove when Thomas came in. He hung up his hat. He poured a cup of coffee. He sat down at the table with the particular manner of a man who had done a large thing and was not going to mention it. She turned from the stove. She looked at him. "Dan Holt came by today," she said. Thomas looked at his coffee. "He talks too much," he said. "Thomas." He looked up. 14 miles, she said. A pause. "The roads are good this time of year. You talked to every one of our suppliers in a single morning to make sure they wouldn't be pressured into dropping us. It seemed like a reasonable use of time. And you went to Whitmore's office." He held her gaze. "I did." "What would you have done," she said quietly, "if he'd had something to say back?" Thomas considered this with apparent seriousness. "I suppose that would have depended on what he said," he replied. "Thomas." "Eleanor." He set down the coffee. "He has been trying to take things from me for 2 years. My suppliers, my bank terms, my confidence that this ranch was worth saving." His voice was steady and precise. "He has not taken it, and he is not going to take you." The last word sat in the air. She held it there for a moment. Then she said, "The stew will be ready in 10 minutes." "All right," Thomas said. She turned back to the stove. Her hands were steady and warm, and she thought, fence posts, one at a time. The rumor campaign collapsed within a week. Not dramatically, not with any single event that could be pointed to as the moment it ended. It simply ran out of momentum, the way rumors did when the people being asked to carry them decided the freight was not worth the trouble. Willow Creek was a small town, and Thomas Caldwell was known in it. And a known man speaking quietly and directly to his neighbors was more powerful than a rich man's whisper campaign. The women at the mercantile stopped talking. Mrs. Garber started making eye contact again. The postmaster's wife asked Eleanor, somewhat sheepishly, if she might share that biscuit recipe after all. Eleanor gave it to her without comment. She was not interested in making people feel bad about having briefly doubted her. She was interested in the work. She had always been interested in the work, in the particular satisfaction of doing something difficult well, in the way a properly run kitchen fed not just bodies, but something harder to name, dignity maybe, or the simple human knowledge that someone had thought carefully about what you needed. The camp runs continued. The Sunday route launched to the Kelsey operation and immediately became their most profitable run. The foreman, a laconic Scotsman named Fergus McRae, turned out to have a weakness for Eleanor's oatcake recipe, which she adapted for the frontier with what she had available, and word spread through his crew with the particular speed of men who had found something unexpectedly good. The money was changing, not dramatically, not yet, but in the ledger, clearly and undeniably. The banknote was no longer an approaching catastrophe. It was a solvable problem. The margin from the camp runs, combined with the reduced waste in the ranch kitchen and the improved productivity of 7 men who were eating properly, had moved the numbers from impossible to difficult. And difficult was a country Eleanor Caldwell had lived in her whole life and knew how to navigate. She sat with Thomas every evening now and went through the week's numbers. This had started as a practical meeting and had become something harder to categorize. The hour after supper, when the men had gone to their bunks and the ranch was quiet, and the two of them sat at the kitchen table with the ledger and coffee, and sometimes talked about numbers, and sometimes talked about other things. He asked about her father one evening. Not prompted, not in response to anything, just asked. Where her father's farm had been, what it raised, what had happened to it. She told him. He listened the way he always listened, completely, without interrupting, with the quality of attention she had noticed about him early, and had come to value more than almost anything else. It was rare, that quality. Most people listened while waiting to speak. Thomas listened because he actually wanted to know. She asked him about the ranch, not the debt, not the problems, but the beginning. His father. What it had been like when he was young. He talked about his father for almost an hour, slowly at first, and then less slowly, the words coming up from somewhere that didn't get opened often. She understood that about him now. He wasn't closed. He was careful. He had learned, somewhere, that opening things up let people in. And letting people in was the kind of vulnerability that life had occasionally punished him for. And so he moved slowly, measuring what was safe to trust. She recognized the habit completely. She had the same one. One night, near the end of the second month, she was going through the ledger, and she stopped. She added a column. She added another. She sat with the calculation for several minutes, checking it twice, then a third time. Then she looked up. "Thomas," she said. He looked up from the fence supply order he'd been reviewing. She turned the ledger around. He looked at the numbers. He looked at her. "Is that?" He stopped. "Eleanor, is that accurate?" "I've checked it 3 times. He looked at the numbers again. At the current rate of income from the camp runs, accounting for the increased supply costs and the wages and the ranch's operating overhead, the trajectory now showed, clearly in figures that didn't lie, that the banknote was not just payable. It was payable early. Not by much. By a matter of weeks, maybe a month if things held, but early. Thomas had been bracing for barely making it. This was different from barely making it. He set his hands flat on the table. She watched something happen on his face that she had not seen before. Not relief, not happiness exactly, but something older and deeper. The feeling of a weight that had been carried so long, the person carrying it had almost forgotten it was there, beginning, slowly, to lift. "It's real," she said quietly. "We can go to the bank next week and restructure the terms from a position of strength rather than desperation." He nodded. He didn't speak for a moment. Then he said, very quietly, "My father built this ranch. I know. He died." He stopped, started again. "He died thinking I'd lose it." Eleanor looked at him. "He was wrong," she said. Thomas looked at her steadily. The look on his face was the clearest thing she had ever seen. She held it for exactly as long as she could, which was not long enough. And then she looked back at the ledger. "We should talk about restructuring terms," she said. "I have some ideas about how to approach the conversation with the bank." "Of course you do," Thomas said. His voice had something in it that wasn't quite teasing. Not from Thomas, who didn't tease, but adjacent to it. Warm in a way that his voice had been getting, incrementally, over weeks. She did not look up from the ledger. "Do you want to hear them?" she said. "Yes," he said. "I want to hear everything you think." She looked up then. She had not planned to. He was watching her with that expression. The clear one, the one without the wall. She thought about fence posts again. About how you built a thing one post at a time and didn't see it until it was already there, and then it was obvious and permanent, and you could not imagine the land without it. She said, "The bank meeting is Monday. I think we should both go." "Yes," Thomas said, "and I think you should let me do most of the talking." A beat. "I was going to suggest the same thing," he said. She held his gaze. "Good," she said. "Then we're agreed." She looked back at the ledger. She could feel him still watching her. She did not look up again, but she was smiling, and she let herself, just barely, because he was looking at the ledger now too, and the kitchen was quiet and warm, and outside the Montana night was enormous and full of stars, and something in the air of Willow Creek Ranch felt. For the first time since she had arrived with her old suitcase and her wooden recipe box and thrown a bowl of gray soup into the dirt, like something that was going to last. The bank meeting was on Monday. On Sunday evening, the night before, Charles Whitmore made his final move. Eleanor was in the kitchen at 7 o'clock, finishing the week's accounts, when she heard horses in the yard, more than one, moving fast. And Thomas's voice outside, sharp in a way she had not heard before. She went to the door. 3 men on horseback. None of them were Whitmore. He was smarter than that, she had learned. 2 of them she didn't recognize. The third was Garfield, the county inspector, looking like a man who was doing something he had been told to do and was not entirely comfortable with it. Thomas was in the yard, standing very still. "Mr. Caldwell," Garfield said. He was not meeting Thomas's eyes. "I'm sorry to come at this hour. There's been a new complaint filed." Eleanor came out of the kitchen. All 3 men looked at her. Garfield looked at the ground. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said, "there's been a claim filed with the county land office regarding the ownership status of a portion of the eastern pasture." Eleanor went still. Thomas turned to look at her. She looked at him. "What portion?" Thomas said. His voice was very quiet. "The portion where the cold storage was built," Garfield said unhappily. "There's a claim that the land was improperly surveyed when the original deed was filed, and that the structure, your storage facility, may have been built on contested land." The silence that followed had a quality to it that Eleanor had not experienced before in this yard. "Who filed the claim?" Thomas said. Garfield did not answer. He didn't need to. Thomas looked at the 2 men who had ridden with Garfield. They were not county officials. Eleanor could see that now. They were surveyors. They had equipment. "You want to survey the eastern pasture," Thomas said. "Tonight. The complaint requires. It's 7 o'clock on a Sunday." "I know." Garfield looked genuinely miserable. "I know. I'm sorry, Tom." Thomas looked at the surveyors. At Garfield. At the document Garfield was holding. Then he looked at Eleanor. She met his eyes. She thought very fast. The cold storage, the eastern pasture, the original deed. She had seen Thomas's deed. She had seen all the ranch documentation when she went through the desk those first weeks, organizing, cataloging. She had a memory for documents, always had, and she was running through what she'd seen, the exact language, the survey markers described in the original filing, the year it was recorded, She went back inside. She heard Thomas say something behind her. She didn't stop to hear what. She went to the desk in the office. She knew where Thomas kept the documents now. She had reorganized them herself, 2 months ago, in the same system she used for the kitchen ledgers. She found the original deed. She found the survey map. She found the county survey record from 1871. She brought them outside. She handed them to Thomas. He looked at her. "Page 3, she said. "The eastern boundary survey markers. They were recorded against the creek line, not the ridge line. If anyone is claiming a discrepancy, the creek line hasn't moved." Thomas looked at the deed. He found page 3. He handed it to Garfield. Garfield read it. He read it again. He looked at the surveyors. One of them, the older one, took the document and looked at the survey map. He pulled a battered notebook from his coat pocket. He looked at the map. He looked at the notebook. He looked at the map again. "The Creek Line Survey," he said, to nobody in particular. "This is an 1871 filing." "It is," Eleanor said. "And the structure in question is—" He looked out at the eastern pasture. "How far from the creek line?" 40 yards, Eleanor said. "I measured when we sighted it." The surveyor looked at his notebook. He looked at Garfield. "There's no discrepancy," he said. "The 1871 markers hold." Garfield closed his eyes for a brief moment. "Right," he said quietly. He took the document back from the surveyor. He looked at Thomas. "I'll file the response with the land office first thing tomorrow." Thomas said nothing. "Tom," Garfield said. He stopped. There was a quality to his stopping that suggested there were things he might say if he were a braver man in a less complicated position. I'll file it first thing." "I know you will," Thomas said. Garfield turned his horse. The two surveyors followed. They rode out of the yard. Thomas and Eleanor stood in the dark and watched them go. Then Thomas said, to the night, in a tone that was more tired than angry, "He's out of options." "Almost," Eleanor said. He looked at her. "Almost?" he said. "He made 3 moves. Legal, the inspection. Social, the rumors. Legal again, the land claim." She looked at the road where the riders had gone. "He's run through the obvious ones. The next thing he does will be the desperate thing." "What's the desperate thing?" She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet," she said. "But we'll see it coming, because desperate people aren't careful." Thomas looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "How did you know where the deed was?" "I reorganized your office in the 2nd week," she said. "I should have told you. I put everything in labeled sections by type and date. You reorganized my office. Your filing system was—" She paused diplomatically. "It was its own system." Thomas made a sound. It took her a moment to recognize it, because she had not heard it before. How was laughing? Quietly, not explosively. Thomas would never be an explosive laugher. But it was real, and it changed his whole face. And she stood in the Montana dark and looked at Thomas Caldwell laughing, because she had reorganized his filing system without telling him. And she felt something happen in her chest that she was done pretending she didn't know the name of. She knew the name of it. She had known the name of it for 2 weeks. She was simply not ready yet to say it out loud. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee. We should go over what we're going to say to the bank tomorrow." "Yes," Thomas said. "All right." He was still almost smiling as he followed her inside. And in the kitchen, over coffee and the ledger, they built the argument they would take to the bank in the morning. Not desperate, not pleading, but the argument of 2 people who had done the work and could prove it, and were going to walk in and lay it down on a banker's desk and let the numbers speak for themselves. Outside, the Montana night did what it always did, enormous and indifferent and full of stars. Inside, for the first time since Eleanor Caldwell had arrived at Willow Creek Ranch, there was nothing approaching fear in the room. Just the 2 of them, and the work, and the numbers that said clearly what they had built. And the thing between them that neither had said out loud yet. Waiting, patient as fence posts, for its moment. The bank was a 2-story brick building on the main street of Willow Creek, the most permanent-looking structure in town, which Eleanor suspected was entirely intentional. Banks needed to look like they would outlast everything around them. It was part of how they worked. She and Thomas rode in together on Monday morning, arriving at 9 o'clock sharp, because Eleanor had learned that arriving exactly on time to a meeting where you needed to project capability was more effective than arriving early, which suggested anxiety, or late, which suggested disorganization. Thomas tied the horses. He offered her his hand as she stepped down. She took it. Neither of them mentioned it. The banker's name was Harold Pruitt, a man in his mid-50s with the cautious eyes of someone who had made a career of reading risk, and the particular wariness of a man who had been contacted, Eleanor was fairly certain, by Charles Whitmore in the last 48 hours. She saw it in the way he greeted Thomas, measured, slightly cooler than their previous dealings, the warmth dialed down a careful degree. She saw it, and she set it aside, and she opened the ledger. "Mr. Pruitt," she said, "I appreciate your time. I'd like to show you where Willow Creek Ranch's finances stand as of this morning." Pruitt looked at Thomas. Thomas nodded slightly. Pruitt looked back at Eleanor with the expression of a man making an internal adjustment. She showed him everything. 6 weeks of camp run revenue. The supply chain documentation. The Hennessy endorsement. The county inspection result. The contracts, written now, properly witnessed, with the Hargrove, Meridian, and Kelsey operations. The projected income for the next quarter based on the current rate. The restructured expense model for the ranch kitchen. The cold storage investment and its return. The wage improvements for the ranch hands and the corresponding improvement in work output and retention. She had thought, over the past 2 days, about what Pruitt would need to see in order to move from cautious to convinced. She had thought about it the way she thought about a difficult meal. What did the person across the table actually need? Not what did they say they needed, and how did you give them that thing in a way that felt like their own idea? Pruitt needed to see that the risk had changed. He had lent money to a failing ranch. He was now looking at a functioning enterprise. He needed the numbers to tell him that story clearly enough that recommending the restructured terms to his board was not a risk he was taking. It was the obviously correct financial decision. She gave him that story. She gave it to him in precise, undramatic language, with documentation behind every claim, in an order that built from the strongest evidence to the projection, so that by the time she got to the forward-looking numbers, he had already seen enough to find them credible rather than optimistic. Pruitt asked questions, good ones, careful ones. She answered them all. Thomas contributed twice, once with a specific figure about the cattle operation that she hadn't had in front of her, and once with a piece of context about the eastern pasture that Pruitt needed, delivered in Thomas's quiet, direct way that Eleanor had come to understand carried its own kind of persuasive weight. At the end of 40 minutes, Pruitt sat back in his chair. He looked at the documents spread across his desk. He looked at Thomas. Then he looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Caldwell," he said slowly, "when Tom first took out the loan on this note, I told him, privately, that I was not confident it would end well." He paused. "I want to be direct with you. I received communication last week suggesting that the operation you're running was legally questionable and financially unsound." Thomas's jaw tightened. Eleanor kept her face perfectly still. "And," she said, "and looking at what you've put in front of me this morning." Pruitt shook his head slightly. The communication was inaccurate on both counts. The breath she took was quiet and controlled. "Then we're in agreement," she said. "We are." He pulled the documents together. "I'll have the restructured terms drawn up this week. The new payment schedule, based on the projected income, should be manageable. If the camp contracts hold, they'll hold," Thomas said. Pruitt looked at him. "I believe you," he said. He gathered the papers. "And Tom, for what it's worth, I'm glad the ranch is still yours." Thomas nodded once, the kind of nod that said everything it needed to. They walked out of the bank into the Montana morning, and Thomas put on his hat and looked at the street and exhaled. A long, slow exhale that Eleanor recognized as the sound of 2 years of held breath beginning to release. She stood beside him and said nothing. He looked at her. "You," he said, "are something I did not know existed." She looked back at him. "A woman who can read a ledger?" she said. "A woman who can walk into a room stacked against her," he said, "and turn it around without ever raising her voice." She held his gaze. "My father taught me that," she said. "The quiet part. He was better at teaching it than practicing it. Smart man. He had his moments." Thomas almost smiled. Then, more serious. "Eleanor, what you did in there." "We did," she said firmly. He looked at her. "We did," he agreed quietly. They rode home. The desperate thing. Whitmore did came 3 days later, and Eleanor had been right. They saw it coming, and she had been right about that too, because a desperate man was not a careful one. He went to the camps. Not personally. He was still smart enough for that. But his man went. The same representative who had spoken to Sutter before the first inspection, who had tried to get the Pearson farm to stop selling eggs, who had been running Whitmore's errands with the particular dogged loyalty of someone whose livelihood depended on his employer winning. The man went to Abe Sutter and told him, with apparent regret and apparent evidence, that Eleanor Caldwell was using substandard flour supplied by a Helena company with a documented history of adulteration complaints. He had a letter. It was official-looking. It cited specific shipment dates. Sutter, to his credit, did not react immediately. He sent word to Willow Creek Ranch. He sent it with Jimmy, who happened to be making a delivery run and who arrived back at the ranch in the early afternoon with the message and an expression that suggested he understood its seriousness. Eleanor read the note. She read it again. Then she went to the pantry and found the flour sack from her most recent Helena delivery and looked at the supplier's mark on the side. She went to her supply ledger and found the Helena company's entry and looked at the shipment date on the bag and looked at the date in the ledger. She went to her files, the ones she had kept, methodically, of every supply invoice since the second week after her arrival. She found the Helena invoice. The company name on the invoice was not the company name Whitmore's man had cited. They were different companies. She had never purchased from the company in the complaint letter. Not once. She had chosen her Helena supplier specifically because she had a reference from 2 other frontier operations she had contacted in the early weeks when she was building the supply chain, and the reference had been good, and she had stayed with them because the quality was consistent. Whitmore's man had gotten the wrong company, or, more likely, had fabricated a complaint and not done thorough enough research to match it to Eleanor's actual suppliers. She collected the invoice, the supply ledger entries, the reference letters from the 2 frontier operations she'd used to select the supplier, the Helena company's own documentation, which she had kept because she kept everything. She handed the folder to Thomas. He read through it. He looked at her. He didn't check, Thomas said. He didn't think he needed to, Eleanor said. He thought a letter with official language and a shipping date would be enough. Because he thought you were keeping informal records. Because he thought I was keeping whatever records a woman keeping house would keep. She looked at him steadily. He has never actually understood what I'm doing. Thomas looked at the folder for a moment. Then he looked up. Go to Sutter? He said. Together, she said. They went that afternoon. Sutter met them at the camp entrance with his arms crossed and the expression of a man who was waiting to be told what to believe. Eleanor put the folder in his hands without preamble. She walked him through it in 10 minutes. The invoice, the ledger, the reference letters, the gap between the company named in the complaint and her actual supplier. Sutter looked at everything twice. Then he looked at Thomas. Then he looked at Eleanor. He sent a man here, Sutter said, with a false complaint. Yes, Eleanor said. To my camp. His voice had gone flat in a way that suggested this aspect of it was the part he found most personally objectionable. To try to get me to drop a supplier who has been feeding my men reliably for 2 months. Yes. Sutter handed the folder back. Mrs. Caldwell, he said, I'd like you to have dinner with 63 men on Saturday. She blinked. I'm sorry? The whole camp. Saturday evening. We have a fire pit. We have tables. We have men who have been eating your food for 2 months and would like to say so to your face. He met her eyes with the direct look she had come to respect from him. And I'd like Charles Whitmore to hear about it, specifically. Thomas made a quiet sound beside her. Eleanor looked at Sutter. I'll need to know your numbers by Thursday, she said, for the supply order. Sutter almost smiled. Thursday, he agreed. The Saturday dinner was not what Eleanor had planned for when she had thrown a bowl of gray soup into the dirt 8 weeks ago. But when she thought about it later, in the weeks after, when she had the distance and the quiet to think about what it had meant, she understood that it was the pivot point. The moment when everything she had built stopped being a financial strategy and became something harder to describe and more permanent. She cooked for 2 days, not alone. That was the first thing she noticed. Jimmy was there without being asked, at 4 in the morning, the same way he had been there for the very first camp run. Deke came at 5, and Walt at 5:30, and by 6 o'clock, all 7 ranch hands were in and around the kitchen, doing whatever she told them to do with the focused efficiency of a crew that had spent 2 months watching her work and had absorbed, without realizing it, how she thought about the logistics of feeding a large number of people well. Thomas was there too. He had been in the kitchen more in the last 2 weeks than in all the weeks before combined. Not taking over. He knew better, and he was not a man who got in the way of someone doing their work well. But present. Helping in the specific ways that she indicated she needed help without her having to explain more than once. She had started to understand that this was how Thomas Caldwell showed things he found difficult to say. He showed up. He stayed. He did the work beside you. She found she had the same habit. It occurred to her, at some point during those 2 days of cooking, that they had been communicating in this language, the language of presence and work and showing up, for the entire 8 weeks, and that perhaps neither of them had needed to say the words, because the words were already everywhere, in everything they had built together, in the 14 miles he had ridden in a single morning, and the deed she had found in the dark, and the coffee left on a table the first night she had arrived. The dinner was on a clear evening, with the summer light lasting late into the sky. 63 men and a handful of foremen and 2 women from a nearby settlement who had come with their husbands and looked around the camp with the particular alertness of women encountering something unexpected. Eleanor supervised the serving from the wagon, the same wagon Jimmy had repaired, that had done dozens of runs in the past 2 months, and watched the camp come alive in the way that good food made things come alive. She had seen it enough times now that she no longer found it surprising, but she still found it moving. The way men who had been silent and separate all week started talking. The way laughter came back into faces that had been too tired for it. The way something as simple as a meal made in good faith and delivered with care could change the whole register of an evening. Sutter gave a short speech. I was not a man who enjoyed speeches, and it showed, which made it better. He said that the Hargrove camp had been better fed for the past 2 months than at any previous point in its operation. He said that the quality of the work had improved correspondingly, which he suspected was not a coincidence. He said that Mrs. Eleanor Caldwell of Willow Creek Ranch had provided a service to this camp that he intended to continue as long as she was willing to provide it, and that anyone who had a problem with that could take it up with him personally. 63 men made a sound of agreement that rolled out across the Montana evening and probably carried further than Sutter had intended. Eleanor stood at the wagon and felt her face do something she couldn't quite control. Thomas appeared beside her. He had been standing slightly back, the way he did in situations where he understood the thing being celebrated was not primarily about him. But he was there, because he was always there now. "You should go accept that," he said quietly. "I'm fine here." "Eleanor." She looked at him. "Go," he said. "You built this." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she walked out from behind the wagon. The sound the camp made when she appeared was not a cheer exactly. These were working men, not a performance crowd. But it was warm and broad and entirely genuine, and it hit her somewhere behind the sternum in a way she was not going to think about in front of 63 people. She thanked them, plainly, without decoration, which felt right for the audience and for her. She thanked Sutter for his confidence from the beginning. She thanked the men for their patience on the early runs, when she was still working out the logistics. She said she was proud of what they'd built together, because that was the truest thing she could say, and it was also true that it had been built together. These men's willingness to show up and eat what she brought was as much a part of the enterprise as anything she'd done in the kitchen. One of the younger miners called out, "When's the next run, Mrs. Caldwell?" "Thursday," she said. "Same as always." He grinned. She walked back to the wagon. Thomas was exactly where she'd left him. She stood beside him and watched the camp settle into its evening, men talking and eating and doing the human thing that good evenings made possible. "Well," Thomas said after a moment. "Well," she agreed. He looked at her. Eleanor, he said, "there's something I should say." She looked at him. His expression was the clear one. No wall, no careful distance. Just Thomas, doing the thing that cost him something. The way Deke had said. The way it always cost him. Because he was not a man who opened things easily. "I was wrong about you," he said. "When you arrived. I looked at you, and I decided." He stopped. "I made a judgment that had nothing to do with who you actually were." She looked at him steadily. "I know," she said. "I should tell you that. You didn't have to ride 14 miles in one morning," she said. "That told me. That told you what I did," he said. "This is me telling you what I think." He held her gaze. "I think you are the most capable person I have ever met. I think you see things other people don't see, and you do things other people decide can't be done. And I think—" He paused. "I think I would like this to be a real marriage, not a practical arrangement. I would like to—" He stopped again. Thomas Caldwell, who always found his words eventually, was working harder for these than she had ever seen him work. I would like to be the kind of husband you deserve." The Montana evening was going gold around them. 63 men were eating and talking 20 yards away. Eleanor looked at Thomas Caldwell. This man who had met her at a wagon with a jaw too tight and eyes full of a fear he was too proud to name, who had left coffee on a table without words, who had built fence line with her post by post in the particular language they had invented together without meaning to. And she thought about all the years she had spent being the woman nobody expected anything good from, and how she had come to a place as far as possible from everything familiar, and how the thing she had found here was not what she had thought she was looking for, and turned out to be the only thing that had ever fit. "Thomas," she said. "Yes. You are already that kind of husband." He looked at her. Something moved through his face. Relief was part of it, and something warmer than relief, and something she recognized because she felt it too, had felt it building for weeks, in the way the kitchen felt different when he was in it, and the ledger was easier to read when he was sitting across the table. He reached out. He took her hand. Unhurried, certain. The way Thomas did everything that mattered, she let him. They stood there in the Montana evening with 63 men making noise 20 yards away, and the sky going amber and rose above the mountains, and his hand warm around hers, and she thought, there it is. There is the fence, already there, already permanent. She just hadn't seen it until now. In the weeks that followed, the story of what had happened at Willow Creek Ranch spread through the valley. The way true things spread, without anyone pushing it, without any drama in the telling. Just the weight of a thing that had actually occurred, finding its own level in the consciousness of a community. Whitmore's final attempt had failed so completely, and had been documented so thoroughly in Eleanor's supply records, that 3 of his own camp clients began making quiet inquiries about alternative arrangements. He had spent 2 months trying to destroy something, and had instead advertised it. The valley knew Eleanor Caldwell's name now. They knew it in the way that mattered. Not as a scandal or a curiosity, but as a fact. The woman at Willow Creek Ranch. The kitchen that showed up on time. The food that tasted like someone had thought about who was eating it. The bank restructuring went through on the terms Eleanor had proposed. Pruitt signed the documents himself and shook her hand across his desk and said, without any of the earlier caution, that he looked forward to a long association. She thanked him and meant it. The Malone Flour partnership formalized into a proper supply contract. Eleanor drafted it herself, had Thomas review it, had Dan Holt witness it, because Holt had a lawyerly mind and she trusted it. The Pearson farm expanded their egg production specifically to meet Willow Creek's needs. 2 new farms along the North Road approached Eleanor about joining the supply network, having watched what she'd built and decided they wanted to be part of it. Dake, at supper one evening in the 3rd month, said without preamble, "You need another driver." Eleanor looked at him. "The Sunday route and the Thursday route can't both run if you're managing the kitchen," he said. "You've been doing it by splitting your time and it's catching up to you." She opened her mouth. "He's right," Thomas said from across the table. She looked at him. "Jimmy can drive the Sunday route," Deke said. "He's good with the horses and he knows the camps. You teach him the service standards and he'll hold them." "Jimmy is 17, Eleanor said. "Jimmy," said Jimmy, from the end of this table, "would very much like to drive the Sunday route." The table had a sound at that. All 7 men, something warm and collective, and Eleanor looked at the faces around her. Deke's careful respect, Walt's weathered steadiness, Jimmy's eager certainty, the other 4 with their particular rhythms. She had learned the way she had always learned people, through the food they ate and the hours they kept and the small choices they made when nobody was watching. And she thought about what Deke had said, that first night he came to the kitchen. "It's knowing someone gives a damn." She looked at them all. "Thursday route stays with me," she said. "Jimmy takes Sunday." Jimmy's face did the thing that young faces did when something they had wanted and half believed in became real. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Thomas looked at her across the table with the clear expression and said nothing. He didn't need to. The night Willow Creek Ranch finally cleared the bank debt entirely came 5 months after Eleanor's arrival, 6 weeks ahead of the restructured schedule. It was not a dramatic night. There was no ceremony. Thomas had ridden to the bank, filed the final payment, ridden home. He came to the kitchen where Eleanor was finishing the morning prep and set the paid receipt on the table without speaking. She looked at it. She picked it up. She set it back down. She turned back to the stove. "Supper tonight," she said. "I'm making the apple cake." Thomas sat down at the table. "The one with the molasses?" he said. "Yes." "Walt's going to weep." "Walt is allowed to weep." She kept working. "He's earned it." A pause. "Eleanor." She turned. He was sitting at the table looking at the receipt, and then at her with the expression that she had stopped needing to brace herself for, because she had learned to simply receive it. The clear look, the one that had no wall. "We did this," he said. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "We did." He nodded. It was enough, and they both knew it. That evening, the whole ranch ate apple cake, and the conversation was louder than usual, and Walt did not weep but came close, and Jimmy told a story about the Sunday route that made everyone laugh, including Deke, and Thomas sat at the head of the table that had once been a place where men ate to survive, and said almost nothing at all, which was his way. But he looked at Eleanor across the table more than once with the expression she knew now, like she knew her own hands. After supper, after the men had gone out, after the kitchen was cleaned and the ledger put away, Eleanor and Thomas sat at the table with coffee the way they always did. The ranch was quiet outside, Montana night pressing against the walls. "I have been thinking," Eleanor said, "about the spring." Thomas looked at her. "The camps are going to grow. The railroad push is moving this direction. I've been in correspondence with a foreman out of Billings. If we expand the wagon operation to 2 vehicles before spring, we can take the new contracts when they come." Thomas looked at her steadily. "You've been in correspondence with a foreman in Billings," he said, "for 3 weeks. While running 3 camp routes, managing the ranch kitchen, restructuring the supply network, and paying off the banknote. It wasn't difficult. I write in the evenings." Thomas set down his coffee. He looked at her with the expression that was both exasperated and something warmer. The combination she had come to love in him because it was so purely Thomas. The man who could not quite believe her and could not stop being glad she was real. "2 wagons," he said. "2 wagons. Second driver. I was thinking Deke, if he's willing. He's been learning the routes." "You've already talked to Deke?" "Last week." "And he said?" "He said yes, but he wants a raise." Thomas looked at the ceiling briefly. "He's going to get a raise anyway," he said. "He knows that." "He does," Eleanor agreed. "He asked anyway." Thomas looked back at her. "2 wagons," he said. "Spring." "Spring," she said. "We have time to prepare properly." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When you came here, I told myself that I needed someone to manage the household. That's what I told myself I was arranging for." She looked at him. "I know," she said. "I told myself," he continued, "that it was practical, that it made sense, that it wasn't—" He stopped. "That I wasn't looking for anything more than that." "I know," she said again, softer. He met her eyes. "I was wrong about that too," he said. She held his gaze across the table in the kitchen she had rebuilt from a smell and a mess, in the house she had come to as a stranger and had made into something she recognized, in the ranch that was alive and solvent and full of the noise of men who had stopped waiting to leave. "Thomas?" she said. "Yes." "I know." He reached across the table. She put her hand in his, the same way she had at the bank, at the camp dinner, certain, unhurried. The language they had built without naming it. They sat there in the quiet with the Montana night outside and the coffee going cold between them, and there was nothing left to prove to anyone. Not to the town, not to the bank, not to Whitmore, not to the women in front of the mercantile, not to the men who had watched her come off the stagecoach and decided before she spoke a word that they already knew everything about her. The woman everyone had underestimated had fed a valley back to life, and in doing so, had built the thing she had not known she was building from the beginning. Not a business, not a reputation, not even a ranch, but a home. A real one. The kind that was not made of walls and a roof, but of people who knew each other truly and stayed anyway. Eleanor Caldwell had come to Willow Creek Ranch with an old suitcase and a wooden recipe box, and the bone-deep knowledge that she was capable of more than anyone looking at her would ever expect. She had been right. And Willow Creek Ranch, the battered, beautiful, half-broken, completely alive thing it had become, was the proof. Not because she had been the strongest person there, or the loudest, or the one with the most obvious power, but because she had seen what was worth saving. She had fed it, and it had grown,